So basically today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be jumping in and talking a little bit about airspace. So I don't know if you guys are aware, but the world itself is broken up into all kinds of different types of airspace, and different types of airspace have different sets of rules about when you are allowed to or are not allowed to fly into that airspace. What do the weather requirements need to be, and a whole bunch of stuff. But realistically, what it all kind of boils down to is if you go back all the way to our first class, right? One of the very first things I talked about was Rob's Rules of Aviation, right? And those three things, right? One, don't hit anything. Excuse me. Two, don't scare anyone. And three, don't make the news, right? And the airspace one, it's like 95% about the don't hit anything and about 5% around the don't scare anyone. And we're not really worrying about the news at this point. Okay. So a couple things before we dive into the details, right? Let's talk really quickly about some of the tools that we have. One that help us understand, help us do what we need to do as pilots, right? And then number two is which help the air traffic control folks potentially keep us separated from other aircraft. And we'll talk in detail about what that actually means and when we actually get that, right? But also it's their way of keeping an eye on us and making sure we don't do things like fly into their airspace, right? And kind of the primary tool still to this day that folks are using is radar, right? I think my guess is that we all pretty much know how radar works, right? Radar, you got yourself a little, radar antenna somewhere that's usually spinning roundy, right? And it's bouncing radio waves out there. And using those radio waves, we'll talk about a couple of different ways in which we do it, something called primary radar and something called secondary radar here in a second, right? But fundamentally, you send a pulse of energy out there, you get an answer back. And whether it's just a passive reflection or whether it's a transponder responding, right? And then what they're able to do is they're able to build a display like you see here on the right side that tells them, some information. Where are their aircraft? In some cases, they can tell what the altitude of the aircraft is. Sometimes they can tell what the ground speed of the aircraft is. They can tell all kinds of information about the aircraft by looking at the radar display. And what that radar display then allows them to do is they can monitor you, or they can tell you what to do, or there's a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So like I said, there's two different types of radar. The first type, and the type that everybody in the world knows about, is something called primary radar. And literally it's sort of like electromagnetic echolocation, right? So imagine that you're a bat. Bat makes a noise. The noise goes out, bounces off bounces off whatever it is that's in front of it, and it hears the reflection. And by measuring the time between when it made the noise and when the noise got back to it, you can say, hey, I know how far away that is. And maybe even by listening to the characteristics of the noise, we can even go ahead and start to understand, is that a hard surface? Is it a soft surface? What are the characteristics of that surface, right? Jeff, in India, right? You think about the Navy using sonar, and it's basically how sonar works, or at least active sonar, right? They do a ping, the sound goes out, bounces off the other submarine, and then you know how far away the submarine is and what direction the submarine is, right? Because you're able to watch the angle at which the sound came back at you. Okay, so all we're doing here with radar. Radar is just an electromagnetic system. Basically, it's light in a non-visible frequency, right? They pulse it out, it bounces off whatever it is, it comes back based on the angle at which, of the return, where the return came from. We know where the aircraft is, and based on the time delay between when the pulse went out and when the pulse came back, we know how far away the aircraft is. And that's pretty much all we know, right? In 2 dimensions where that aircraft is, right? There are some radar, right? If you get into high-end aircraft have weather radar on them, right? And you can start using weather radar. You can start tilting it up and down and, panning it left and right. You can do all kinds of stuff with a radar set to kind of like paint a picture of what things look like in 3 dimensions. But realistically, they're not doing that with most primary radars that I've ever seen. It just says, okay, over in this location, there's a reflection, there's something there. And it would be nice if we had a little more information than that. And so that's where this thing called secondary radar comes in. And what secondary radar does is it actually relies on a transponder that is on the aircraft, right? And so the idea is that if I send the interrogation out to that transponder. I mean, get a response from that transponder. The response, the delay between the send and the response tells me how far away the device is, or the transponder is, right? The angle tells me the angle. So I'm still getting that primary radar type of information. But what it also can do is I can encode information in there. And so there's a couple different types of transponders, right? We have the very simple mode A transponders that go back, back to for a while. They return a 4-digit octal code. It's just a number, right? And what that code they can do is if you call up air traffic control, they can assign you a code. And then when your transponder responds, they know who you are, right? So what they can do is they can radar identify you and say, okay, that is 172 Tango Golf, right? You jump into mode C. A mode C transponder still does that 4-digit octal code, but what it also returns is it returns a pressure altitude. So it actually has a connection into the static source. It's measuring the pressure altitude of the aircraft, right? It responds with that pressure altitude. The controller has dialed into their scope what the local altimeter setting is, right? And so the idea here is that they can then do the math and convert that pressure altitude to an absolute altitude, or I'm sorry, to a true altitude, right? And now they know, not only do they know where you are, they know how high you are, right? And they can actually track your target. And by watching how your target moves, they also, and this works for mode A as well as mode C, they can also go ahead and they can figure out like your ground speed. So pretty cool stuff, right? Now they've even gone one step further with something called mode S, right? Mode S adds more data into that response. There's a lot to mode S, but the one thing that everybody always thinks of is you actually have a unique identifier for your aircraft. And this is the one that everybody, I got to admit, there are a lot of people who are like really nervous about this because now, without you even calling ATC, they can look at that blip on the scope and go, ooh, that's Amy. Oh, I wonder why Amy's inside my airspace, right? And so it kind of becomes a little bit of a ability to kind of tattle on you. Okay. So in our case, what we have is we have a transponder on the aircraft, right? And so this is the transponder. I took this picture straight out of out of the simulator that we've been using. Obviously, if you get in the real aircraft, it's going to be a little bit different, right? But it's not a whole lot different. And basically what you have is you've got a few different doodads, buttons you can push and things you can do, right? So one of the things you can see here, we've got this 1200, right? And that 1200 is the code. And we'll talk about kind of some standard codes that we use for various purposes. You're going to squawk 1200 a lot, trust me. But basically what that is, that's that 4-digit octal code. So any number can be anywhere from 0 to a 7, right? If you're a VFR aircraft that's not talking to anybody, we're expected to squawk 1200. If we're then call ATC, ATC is probably going to go, especially as a radar controller, is going to assign us a code. We type in the code and now they know that we are who we say we are, and it kind of works. Okay.
0 to 8,
I'm
or
sorry,
a code from 0 to 8 or 0 to 7.
0 to 7. It's
Okay,
basic.
got it.
Um, and then the next one we have this little ident button. That ident button is kind of fun. If you push the ident button, it's a little bit flip in the response. And what it does, the way it works is it makes your icon flash on the controller scope. So you push it, your icon flashes for a few minutes. So every once in a while, I have a controller say, "Hey, Sky 172 Tango Golf ident," and you just reach over, push the button, right? And you flash on the scope. A lot of times when you do your initial call up, you say, "Hey, here I am. I'm over the Kennebunk VOR at 3,000 feet." The first question he's going to ask is, "Okay, go ahead and ident." You ident. It makes it easy for them to find you on the scope. They go, "Okay, that's you. All right," and then they can do what they got to do. Okay. Um, we also have the mode button. Sometimes it's a mode button, sometimes it's a rotary selector switch. There's a whole bunch of different things. But basically, I guess you could argue that there are 5 modes, maybe even 6 modes, right? But there are 4 main modes that we see on pretty much every transponder out there, right? Starting from the bottom, there's the OFF mode. Means it's turned off, right? You put the knob in the off position, and essentially the transponder powers down, right? There's the standby mode, which is my transponder is turned on, but I'm not replying to any signals. Okay. We can then go to the on mode. On is effectively that mode A. And so all we're doing is we're responding with the code, but we're not responding with the pressure altitude. And if you have a mode S transponder, it'll respond with all the mode S stuff, but it won't respond with the pressure altitude. And the reason we do that is if for whatever reason that altitude encoding gets goofy, they may just ask you, to just, stop squawking altitude. But what they're saying is turn to the on position so you're not sending me bad data about how high you are, right? Sometimes what will happen is an aircraft will, if let's say you're at 4,000 feet, but your, transponder is saying you're at 7,000 feet. If another aircraft is at 7,000 feet, even if the controller knows that you're at 4,000 feet, right? You've talked to the controller, you figured out that there's a problem. It still sets off all kinds of alerts and everything else, and can also cause what's known as the TCAS event, which is the traffic collision avoidance system some of the more advanced aircraft have. And so it's really helpful if you can turn off that altitude squawk, if you need to, right? And then the last mode you see is something called the altitude mode, which is obviously exactly what you would expect, right? It means we're going to go ahead and squawk the code. We're also going to squawk altitude, right? And that way the controller is getting all the information. 9 times out of 10, right, you're going to be squawking altitude. There is one little variation here, right? And the variation is there's something called ground mode. And I've been digging and trying to get straight information on what ground mode actually means. What ground mode really is just the transponder knows that it's on the ground, but it's still behaving as if it's in altitude mode. Okay. In the old days, they used to expect us to go ahead and turn the transponder off after landing. Because what would happen is your transponder, as you get close to a radar, your transponder reply kind of blocks all the replies that are behind it, right? It's sort of like having a flashlight in front of somebody else, I don't know. So you imagine like somebody's like trying to send signals with a flashlight, right? Do Morse code, and you're in front of it with a big lantern or something, right? And so traditionally in the old days, we used to always go to standby after landing. In practice, we don't do that anymore because the technology in air traffic control has advanced to the point where they don't need us to. And we're starting to see a lot of systems actually at big airports. Things like ASDX will actually track you as you're on the ground, and they use your transponder as part of their technique to try to spot potential runway incursions. Okay, so these days we just leave the transponder on after we land, right? And then the last mode that you'll sometimes see is something called the test mode. It's exactly what you think. It's just doing a self-test on the transponder. Not really a big deal. Okay. But so this is like 90% of what you're going to see. Now this is the a replica of the Garmin transponder, right? There are other types of transponders out there. I'll show you a completely different type here in a second. Our Stratus transponders work very similarly to that Garmin transponder. Okay. There are also a number of codes that have special meaning, right? So you're going to be assigned codes whenever you talk to air traffic control. But if you're not assigned a code, or even if you are assigned a code, sometimes using a code is pretty important. Okay. So we already talked about the 1200 code. 1200 code says I'm a VFR airplane, right? And oh, by the way, there's a few variations on the 1200 code. If you go down to like DC, you can do pattern work around certain aircraft locations that are inside of what's known as the special flight rules area, right? Where you get near DC and everybody gets really security conscious, and they've kind of gone nutso about little airplanes. They have special codes that you use to identify that you're on a flight plan and you're in the traffic pattern at an airport, but don't bother me, right? There's also another code for gliders, right? So there's a few different things like that. There are also emergency codes, which if you're ever in distress, and there's different types of distress, right? There are codes that you can squawk, right? And it's just 3 basic codes. 7500 means you've been hijacked, right? You don't want to squawk to 7500 by mistake. You very likely, somebody like Kristen's going to show up in a fighter jet and say hey to you, right? 7600 is the one that says I've lost the ability to communicate. So if you're flying along talking to the air traffic control and all of a sudden your radios all die, right? Or if we have to, or remember some of the emergencies that we talked about earlier, right? If that would have happened, we would potentially have to, um, shut down all of our radios. If we left our transponder on, we could squawk 7600, and it's kind of our way of saying, hey, just so you know, I can't talk to you right now, right? And then 7700 is just a blanket, I'm in distress, right? And so the little way we always commit it to memory, right? 75 means you're taken alive. 76 means you're in a fix. I don't know where that one came from. And 77 means you're going to heaven, right? You got a serious problem on your hands that you're trying to resolve, right? I'll tell you right now, if you squawk 7700, or actually if you squawk any of these, but especially 77 or 75, you're going to get the attention of every air traffic control facility out there. You may also get some assistance whether you want it or not. Especially in regards to the 7500 squawk, right? And if you have the 7700, they will just make a hole around you, and it kind of becomes this little, you're in this protective bubble, which basically means you can do just about anything you want, right? It's a wonderful system that they have. Do me a favor, don't. I see people do this. Actually, I think I got it. Yeah, it's on these transponders, right? So this is an old style KT76A transponder. This is the stuff that Sue and I grew up on, right? So you can see it's got a lot of the same modes on it. It's got the code, it's got an ident button, and that's pretty much it. The one thing they always taught us was you had to learn which way the numbers went on the dial, because you always did everything you could to make sure you never put that first number on a 7. And the reason is you don't ever want to accidentally squawk one of these emergency codes, right? And so that was just, if I was flying along and I would roll through 7 on my way to another number, my instructor would yell at me. So just something to be aware of. Okay. So how do we use this radar stuff as private pilots? Well, there's this thing called radar services. All right. And so what that allows us to do is that allows us to call up either we can call a terminal radar approach control facility, right? Otherwise known as a TRACON. And then what TRACONs are, they are exactly what it sounds like, right? They're approach control for an airport or for a set of airports. And so, we have there's an approach control facility centered on Portland, Maine, called Portland Approach, right? There's one on Bangor, Maine, called Bangor Approach. There's one around Boston called Boston Approach. There's one around Manchester, also called Boston Approach, right? Because Boston is actually what's known as a consolidated TRACON, and they've combined. What are they up to now? Manchester, Boston, Cape Cod, and I can't remember if they've done Providence yet or not. But it's multiple different approach control facilities have all moved under one roof. They all go by the same name, but they're still kind of separate organizations, right? But you have, you've got New York Approach. You have, and so at Portland, or I'm sorry, at Sanford, we're technically under the Portland Approach area, right? If you were in the air directly over the Sanford Airport and you're talking to approach control, you're going to be talking to Portland Approach. We're actually right on the boundary. There's a boundary line between us and just kind of southwest of us is where we get into what those of us who've been around forever still think of as Manchester's airspace, right? So if you were to fly from like Portland to Manchester, they would switch you to your first Boston Approach facility pretty much right over top of Sanford Airport, right? And so if you're north and west, or sorry, north and east of us, you're talking to Portland on 119.75. If you're south and west of us, you're going to be talking to Boston on 125.05. Okay. And it's just the way it's set up. It happens, right? If you go north of Portland, right? So eventually you get to the edge of Portland's airspace. There's some areas up there where it touches Bangor, but there's a whole lot of nothing up there too, right? And especially if you go past Bangor, there's definitely a whole lot of nothing. And so what happens is you get into airspace where there's no approach control facility, right? And that's where we have the center. So the center is going to cover like low density areas. And then the center also covers high altitude areas. So once you get above about 6,000 to 10,000 feet, depending on what the agreements are between the facilities, you're going to be getting into center airspace. Okay. Both the TRACONs and the centers can provide radar services to us. And what that means is that if you call them up, they'll keep an eye on you. So if you need assistance in something, let's say you're dealing with an emergency pops up and you got to deal with it. Hey, you've already got somebody on the line. And then the other thing which they'll do is they'll keep an eye out for potential conflicts traffic wise. So if you're flying along and there's another airplane coming at you, and there's you're going to get kind of close to each other, they'll do what's, they'll call the traffic to you. They'll tell you where the traffic is. They may even suggest a heading or an altitude or whatever to try to deconflict between the two. It's important to understand, though, this is a time available service. They are in no way responsible for separating you from other traffic. And they're not, obligated to track you wherever you go. There have been times, I've had times where I've been flying along and they forgot to switch me to the next frequency and they forgot to tell me that I was getting to the edge of their airspace. And I kind of go motoring off into the Never Never Land because I didn't know where the boundary was. And eventually I realized I can't talk to them anymore. Right? They're not going to initiate search and rescue. They're not going, or they're not required to. I mean, if they suspect something's wrong, they will. They're going to give you a very high level of service, and it's really easy to think that you're always, it's like their responsibility to do all this stuff. And then every once in a while, they just get slammed, and you're the first thing to fall through the cracks, right? So just be aware that it's a great tool. It does not relieve you of any responsibility to do your own see and avoid and everything else. Okay. So the good news about radar is really expensive. And we live in the modern technology world. And I don't think we're going to see the end of radar anytime soon, but I think we're going to start seeing a reduction in the use of radar, right? And probably a reduction in the number of radar facilities and things like that, because there's new technology that's come out in the last, decade or so called ADS-B out, right? And what this is a case where aircraft have the ability. So we have GPS capabilities now that are absolutely amazing. We'll talk about GPS on Tuesday, right? We have absolutely amazing GPS capabilities. And so what we have the ability to do is have our aircraft using a WAAS-equipped GPS, which we'll talk again about what WAAS-equipped means. It's cool stuff, right? And it can learn physically where am I, both, latitude and longitude way and altitude wise, right? We then have a data channel that we can then broadcast that information to other users. And those other users can be other aircraft. They can also be air traffic control ground stations, right? And so what happens is now ATC can build a very accurate picture. It's actually more accurate than what radar tells you, right? Without the need to go ahead and actually have expensive radar systems. So this whole thing started out up in Alaska where they have all kinds of airspace with no radar, right? And it worked really, really well. And it's expanded now to the point where it's pretty much it's, most airspace has the ground component to it. And the FAA has required that anywhere that we used to, this is literally just a couple of years old, anywhere that we used to be required to have transponders, right? Mode C transponders, we're now required to also have the ability to do ADS-B out. Okay. And so we now have ADS-B out on all of our airplanes. It's kind of cool. Okay. There's a bunch of components to ADS-B. So ADS-B is just one of them. That's the aircraft transmitting things, right? We also have something called ADS-B or ADS-R, which is the rebroadcast. And so what ATC now does is some of the facilities take data in. And I got to kind of touch on a couple things. So we have radar, right? So if you look over here on the left side, you have the radar set, right? You also, under ADS-B, we actually have two different frequency bands. There's what's known as UAT, which is 960 megahertz, I think, which is kind of used mostly by low altitude small airplanes. And then you have the more expensive to equip 1090, which is what all the airliners do. It's a more powerful thing designed for higher altitude, right? So it's kind of two different ADS-B systems. And so what the ADS-R rebroadcast will do is it takes all the data from all the sources and then retransmits it to both UAT and 1090 ES. And so the result is now is if you're in an area that's covered by ADSR, you can see all the other aircraft that are out there, and we can actually see it on our, on our tablets. We may be able to see it on our avionics. There's a whole bunch of different places where you can see this information. It's huge, right? We also couple into this something called FIS-B. FIS is Flight Information Services. And this is a broadcast of it. What they're doing is they're using this data channel that we now have, this UAT or the 1090 ES, or think of it as the ADS-B data channel, right? And from that same ground station that they're sending the traffic information to you, right? What they can also do is they can also send you a whole bunch of other information. If you look at this list, right, stuff that we've pretty much talked about, right? AirMets, SIGMETs, convective SIGMETs, meteorological reports, radar, like CONUS NEXT-RAD and regional NEXT-RAD, and notices to airmen, and pilot reports, and I mean, just all kinds of information just pops up. If we'll next week we'll pull out a ForeFlight tablet and just look at some of the information that's available to you. You can get this information in flight without even having like a cell phone turned on. Okay, this is huge. You can actually see on the map where the thunderstorms are. Sue and I go back to the dark ages. I literally remember flying around when all I had for thunderstorm avoidance was this little thing that theoretically told you where the lightning pulses were. Right? Once you got in the air, you were blind unless you got on a special frequency and called flight services. Now we have, up-to-date weather maps right there in the cockpit. It's amazing. Okay. And then what we also have is we have ADS-BN, right? And ADS-BN is the ability, this is kind of where it all comes together. This is the ability of your aircraft, or sometimes it's even your personal device, to receive data from outside. So if you look at this little setup that we have here, right, this is an iPad. The iPad looks like it's probably running, it looks like ForeFlight or ForeFlight-ish, right? And so they're pulling in data. And what you see over here at the left, this is, we used to own one of these. This is a little Stratus ADS-B receiver. It's literally, you go to the pilot shop, you buy it, and you duck, it's not even physically attached to the aircraft, right? It's got a battery in it, or you can charge it from a USB port. But it just sits there on this little rubber pad on your glare shield, right? And then there's a Wi-Fi connection between that and your iPad. And son of a gun, you got all kinds of information, right? You can see where the terrain is. You can see where the thunderstorms are. You can see where the traffic is. You can get your NOTAMs. You can get your weather reports. You can get all kinds of stuff. Okay. So we, in our aircraft at the flight school, we have the little Stratus transponder that we have. What I like about the Stratus transponder is it's made by the same company that made the little Stratus portable unit. And so what you can do is you can get in the airplane, connect via Wi-Fi from your tablet to the aircraft, and start receiving all that weather information, all that traffic information, and it'll show it for you. So it's pretty cool. Just do me a favor. Sometimes you got to look out the window still, right? And then the last service we're going to talk about here is the TIS-B, right, which is Traffic Information Service. And I describe this is backwards ADS-B, right? So in this case, what you have is all these aircraft that have ADS-B, but you still have some non-equipped people out there, right? TIS-B is the old method that we did before ADS-B, where through a data channel, it's kind of like part of that Mode S thing we were talking about. Through a data channel, ATC is able to send traffic information out to you. And so now what you can do is you can see on your traffic screen where the other airplanes are. This is kind of falling out of favor because pretty much everybody these days has some sort of ADS-B capability. Okay. Make sense?
Yep.
I feel like I'm talking a lot. All right. So kind of this next section here is about don't hit each other, right? So one of the big things that we as pilots have to do is we have to avoid midair collisions, right? If you think about it, when I was a kid, I used to live about 2 blocks from my elementary school, and my elementary school had this really big blacktop, and we'd all go up there and we'd ride bikes around the blacktop. We'd go as fast as we could, right? It was maybe 100 yards by 100 yards. And every once in a while, you end up with two kids going straight at each other, playing, unintentionally playing chicken, right? Because we didn't really have air traffic control out there. That's not dissimilar. What we're doing in air aviation is basically a three-dimensional version of that, right? And we have airplanes flying around in all kinds of different directions and all kinds of different angles and stuff like that. It is, I'm not going to say it happens all the time, right? We have a big sky, but there is the potential for airplanes to come together. I know I've been flying along and all of a sudden I've looked out and here goes an airplane way closer to me than it should be. I had a Learjet go by me one time so close that I could hear it, right? I'm sure, Sue, you've had the same kinds of experiences, right?
Oh, yeah.
In fact, we might have even been in the same airplane on a couple of them. Right. So it's one of those things that you just want to be on guard, because if you're not getting radar services and the other person's not getting radar services and somebody's not looking out the window very well, it kind of becomes on us to go ahead and respond, right? So there's fundamentally two different ways in which we can avoid other aircraft, right? I love this slide. This is like one of my favorite slides, right? On the one side is if you're not talking to air traffic control, right, we have to see and avoid the other aircraft. Now, you're right. A lot of those aircraft are going to show up on the little tablet on the thing, right? And we're going to be able to look at our tablet and see exactly where all the other airplanes are. And if we click on it, we can see the tail number and, hey, oh, that's Sue. I know who that is, right? It works, right? In most cases. Where it doesn't work is there are still aircraft out there that don't have ADS-B out, that don't have, that aren't talking to air traffic control, may not even have a transponder, right? I can think of a bunch of examples. One example is Amy when she goes hurtling out of that airplane at 13,000 feet and comes straight down like a meat bomb, right? India, you used to fly hang gliders, right? Yes, no?
Yes, I'm just having
Yeah.
trouble muting.
Yeah. So you guys didn't have transponders on those hang gliders, right?
We did not.
No, there's no electrical system on a hang glider, right? I guess technically I still do, although I haven't done it in a long time. Fly regular gliders, right? Again, there's no engine, there's no electrical system, there's no nothing. It's just a hunk of metal with some ailerons and some elevator and some very basic controls, right? You take some of these old airplanes, right? My friend Cindy, she has a 1946 Champ that, when she bought it, didn't even have an electrical system, right? You had to hand prop this thing to get the engine running. None of these things are going to have ADS-B out. They're all going to be flying around in the same airspace that we fly around in. The only way you're going to be able to avoid them is by looking out the window and actually seeing where they are, right? I mean, I remember one case I was doing a photo flight over a house. It was a little lake house right on the edge of the lake. It was really kind of beautiful. And here I am, and I'm flying circles around this thing as the photographer is trying to get photos. And on like the third circle, I come around, and this guy must have just taken off from his backyard in a powered parachute. And I just want to say his sunglasses are really nice. That's how close we got, right? And oh, by the way, I made another 360, came around the next time. He was nowhere to be seen. I think I scared the daylights out of him and he went back into his backyard. So we really have to be looking outside and making sure that we know where we are, right? And making sure that we know where the other aircraft are. If for some reason you can't see outside, right? And specifically what we're talking about is days where you're going to be flying in the clouds, i.e. you would have to fly under what are known as instrument flight rules, right? A big part of instrument flight rules is your flying clearances given to you by air traffic control. They are then taking the responsibility for keeping you from colliding with somebody else, right? So ATC can do separation services. And we'll talk about a couple of cases. There's like a few cases where they'll do it for VFR aircraft, right? But for the most part, as a visual flight rules aircraft, ATC will not give you separation. And so we're going to be stuck doing the see and avoid, okay? So it brings us to a big question. Let's say I'm flying along, right? I'm flying along at the same level as a cloud, and an airplane comes popping out of that cloud. how much time do I need to see and avoid the aircraft? Right? So one of the things is I'm not seeing everything all at once, right? We have to use a scan method to actually see, do it. It takes me about 30 seconds to see the whole sky. Okay. I don't know if Sue, you may have a different number or anybody else may have a different number, but it's about 30 seconds to do a full scan. Right. If I then see an airplane coming at me, what do I have to do? Well, I have to, one, kind of do some calculations and say, is that airplane coming at me? Are they off to one side, the other side? Which way do I need to turn to get away from them? Right? Or do I even need to turn to get away from them? Assuming I have to turn to get away from them, right? What is my new heading going to be? And how far do I need to go? So I need to actually turn the aircraft and then take enough time to get out of that kind of zone of collision risk. Okay. This is not a short process. You're looking at several seconds at least, right? Probably tens of seconds for you to get out of that zone where there's a risk. And so depending on how fast that airplane's coming at you, you may or may not have enough time. Okay. So that leads us to three questions. How fast can airplanes fly? How fast can they climb? Because we could be above a cloud and have them come out of the cloud, right? How fast can they descend? Because we might be below the cloud and have them coming out of that cloud, right? And the answers to this are actually fairly easy to figure out, okay? There are speed limits in aviation, okay? If you're in certain circumstances or near an airport, right? And I've got them enumerated below, right? So if you're within 4 nautical miles, I don't know why this is nautical miles. Every other distance thing we do around airports is in statute miles. This one's in nautical miles. Don't ask me why, right? But if you're within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport in Class C or Class D airspace, and don't get hung up on Class C versus Class D. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, right? You are limited to 200 knots. If you're below Class B airspace, you are limited to 200 knots. And if you're in a VFR corridor within Class B airspace, right, you're going to be limited to 200 knots. That's pretty good, right? These are all very congested areas. It's probably a good idea to be down around 200 knots. Not an issue for us, by the way, right? If you get a Skyhawk up to 200 knots, the wings are going to come off. Okay. If you are not in one of those three circumstances, but you are still below 10,000 feet, you are limited to 250 knots. And by the way, the 200 knots and the 250 knots are both knots indicated airspeed. That means that your needle can't show more than 200 or 250, right? There are exceptions. If you get into the really big, heavy aircraft, some of them can't safely fly, flaps up at less than 250 knots. And so they're allowed to operate at minimum safe airspeed, right? But generally speaking, a civilian aircraft especially, right, it's 200 to 250 knots when you're below 10,000 feet. And then if you go above 10,000 feet, we're just basically not allowed to make a lot of noise. So we got to stay under Mach 1, right? No sonic booms. And so that's kind of the speed limits that we plan, right? This can then translate into some interesting details. One is, remember, we're talking, these are indicated airspeeds, right? They're not true airspeeds, which means as we get higher, our airspeed is going to increase. So if I look at that 250 knot airspeed, right? By the time I'm up at 18,000 feet, or let's actually look at 10,000 feet. 10,000 feet, I might get around 280, 290 knots. Right? At 18,000 feet, I'm at almost 325 knots. Right? So we accelerate as we get higher. Same thing happens with the 200 knots. Same thing happens down here. We run at about 100 knots. But if that gets us up to about 9,000 feet, we're running at about 125 knots. Right? So we have to kind of think through this math. Okay. And so when it comes to trying to estimate how fast an airplane is going to go, in this case, we're talking about how fast we can go below 10,000 feet. What we have to think about is, what are my constraints, right? So Ford is a legal problem, right? We have a speed limit. And my speed limit, right, says I'm not allowed to go faster than 250 knots indicated airspeed. If I do some arithmetic at 10,000 feet, that 250 knots indicated is going to be roughly 290 knots true airspeed, right? I can actually calculate that as about 483 feet per second, right? Yeah, roughly half the speed of a slow bullet. Okay. As far as climb goes, right? Climb is a physics problem, right? It's just simply how fast can the aircraft climb? The aircraft climb due to excess thrust. And so any extra power that they have available to them that would let them go faster than 250 knots, right, is what they're going to turn into climb. And typically what they're going to be doing is they're going to be climbing about 60 feet per second, right? I think that's about 3,000 feet per minute. Okay, pretty quick, right? And then the other thing which we can do is we can descend. Anybody know what the restriction is on descent? You think you'd be able to descend pretty quick, right? That is actually a restriction. And what it is it's if let's say I start at like 35,000 feet and my cabin is at like 6,000 feet or 8,000 feet, right? So they got like, pressurized cabin, but the cabin's still higher than field elevation. I can only move a person at about 500 feet per minute. If the pressure around you changes it more rapidly than 500 feet per minute, we're probably going to get used to it. We'll be fine because, hey, we're pilots. We know how to yaw. We know how to do the Valsalva thing. We can equalize the pressure between the inside and the outside fairly well if you know how to do it. But your typical passenger, if you descend a cabin pressure-wise at more than 500 feet per minute, right, then what that means is that they're going to have a lot of discomfort. Okay? So if I know that if I need to go from let's say I got to go from 8,000 feet to sea level, I need at least 16 minutes to come down from an 8,000 foot cabin altitude to a sea level altitude. If the airplane's at 36,000 feet, I need 16 minutes to come down that distance. Okay, and so what that really translates to? They come down at around 33 feet per second. They come down at around 2,000 feet a minute at most. Right? 1,000, whatever, 33. I should have done all the math here. But, they come down more slowly than they go up. Okay? So what this translates to how the FAA regulations are written. Kind of our standard cloud clearance requirement is I need to be I can be up to 500, I have to be at least 500 feet below a cloud, right? I have to be at least 1,000 feet above the cloud. And then I have to be at least 2,000 feet horizontally from the cloud. It sounds great. It's not, right? If an airplane is descending out of the cloud and you're 500 feet below it, you have about 15 seconds before it hits your altitude. Maybe enough time to avoid it. Climbing, and I don't know why I deleted the thing for climb, but if you're 1,000 feet above it, remember we're climbing faster. Again, it's going to be about 15 seconds, right? Horizontally, if you have 2,000 feet separation, remember those airplanes are moving at roughly, and I'm assuming, by the way, that you're not flying directly towards the cloud. You're going around the cloud, not at the cloud, right? 4 seconds is about all you get because they're moving pretty close to 500 feet per second, right? 4 seconds is absolutely 100% not enough time for you to avoid, right? No way, no how are you avoiding somebody with a 4-second closure. And so this is where, a good suggestion is don't fly between the clouds. Like, don't be flying at the same altitude as clouds, right? Be either above them or below them, even if you're not directly over top of them, because it's really going to help you out when it comes to avoiding that Learjet that pops out of the cloud. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
No? Okay.
Yep.
There's no rule that says you're not allowed to do that. Trust me, you don't want to do that. Okay. When we get above 10,000 feet, the rules change, right? Because what happens is as we climb above 10,000 feet, instead of having that 250 knot speed restriction, our speed restriction is no sonic booms. Now that's a little bit of a false economy, right? I mean, Sue's a physicist. Sue, what happens to the speed of sound as you climb? I like putting Sue on the spot.
Let's see, the air gets less dense, so it's gonna go down.
Yeah, sound goes slower. The way I remember it is in a vacuum, nobody can hear you scream because the speed of sound is 0 feet per second. Right? Actually, there's no medium, so I guess nothing's going to happen. Right. So as air gets less dense, sound goes slower. As the medium gets more dense, sound goes faster. That's why whales have these songs that they can sing over, like, all kinds of distance, is because, the sound propagates really well underwater. It doesn't propagate nearly as well through the air. Definitely doesn't propagate well through the air above 10,000 feet. Right. But it still means that we can go faster. Right. So our forward speed is going to increase. Right. Our descent rate is going to stay the same because we still have the same 500 foot per minute cabin out, pressurization change restriction. Right. Our climb rate is going to decrease. And the reason our climb rate decreases is because we're using more power to overcome that parasitic drag that lets us go fast. Right. And so there's less excess thrust available to us to make us climb. And so if we go ahead and we jump into our little setup here, the rules above 10,000 feet are there's a couple of rules. One, so now instead of 500 below, we have to be 1,000 feet below the cloud. Right. Above, we still only need to be 1,000 feet above the cloud. And so the result is you get about 30 seconds of warning on either side. That's pretty good, right? And then what they do is they push us out to 1 statute mile horizontally. So we've gone from 2,000 feet horizontally to 5,280 feet horizontally, right? And so that pushes that 4 seconds, gets pushed up to 9 seconds. Okay, still not quite enough, right? I still don't want to be at the same altitude as the clouds, but at least we're getting better, okay? The caveat being those airplanes are going faster, right? And so there's another restriction that they place on us when we go above 10,000 feet, which is we have to have a Mode C transponder. And because we have to have the Mode C transponder, we have to have ADS-B out. So if you're more than 2,500 feet above the ground and you're over 10,000 feet MSL, you're required to have the ability to report your altitude. You have to have electronic means of telling somebody that you're there. Okay. Can it make sense?
Yes.
All right. Good deal. So we figured this out, right? How do we not hit other people? We get radar services because it's better to have it than not have it. You do a proper scan and you stay away from the clouds, right? By the way, how can you tell that you're 1,000 feet below clouds or above clouds or 1 statute mile horizontally away from clouds? Or, if I come back over here, 2,000 feet or 500 below. I mean, how do we measure this? So somebody's got to have a good answer, right? The answer is we don't. Right? I mean, some of them, the below and above, I climb up there, I can tell you, if the bottom of the cloud is lined up with the horizon, I'm at the same altitude as the bottom of the cloud. Okay, I better go 500 feet down, right? But for the most part, we don't really have a good way of telling how far away these clouds are. And so you're kind of doing your best effort to try to do cloud clearance, right? That's the bad news. The good news from an enforcement point of view, I'd never yet seen an FAA inspector hiding in a cloud with a laser pointer, right? So it is kind of the honor system. We do the best we can. But trust me, from a safety perspective, cloud clearance requirements, it's not just a legal requirement. It really is a safety requirement to make sure we meet the cloud clearance requirements that are out there. Okay. So we figured out how not to hit other people. The next question that pops up here is, how do we not hit the ground? Okay. There's two main ways in which people hit the ground. One is something called loss of control in flight. This happens a lot, right? This is probably, I mean, this is a subject that has been on the FAA's top 10 list forever. It is known as LOCF, is the industry way of referring to it. And this is things like, somebody's turning from base to final and they lose control of the aircraft. And next thing you know, the aircraft stalls, it spins, it goes roundy, roundy, it hits the ground, right? Loss of control in flight accidents, they're almost always fatal, right? And your chances of having a loss of control accident in flight goes up as visibility goes down. And so you're going to see that visibility is very important here. Now, the FAA doesn't really care about your ability to control the aircraft. When they wrote the regs, they weren't thinking about your ability to control the aircraft. They were just thinking about your ability to see other aircraft. And it kind of comes back to this concept that they have around Part 91 operations, which is they don't really mind if you kill yourself. They just don't want you killing other people. Right? And I know it's kind of scary, right? But we are the ones who are responsible for our own safety to a very large degree in general aviation. You start going fly for the airlines or for the charter operators or the military or whoever. A lot of times they have much more stringent rules because when you're flying a plane load of passengers, it's not just you anymore. It's your passengers are entrusting you with their lives, and so there's an expectation that you're going to be a little bit more precise, right? So let's be clear that the rules, and I'll show you in detail about this, the rules around visibility are not required or are not designed to keep you from having a loss of control in a flight accident, right? The other thing which happens is something called controlled flight into terrain, right? And literally what that is I didn't know the mountain was there, right? There's a famous Far Side cartoon of, two pilots in an airplane looking out, and you can see that there's a cloud in front of them, and there's like a break in the cloud, and there's a goat sticking his head through the cloud, right? And one pilot's saying to the other, "What's a goat doing up here?" Right? And the joke, of course, is it's not that the goat's up here, it's that they're down there, right? There have been numerous cases over the years where people have literally just flown airplanes into the side of mountains, right? Because they were lost. They didn't know where they were. And a lot of times they don't know where they are because they didn't have the visibility to see where the mountain was, right? And then there have been other ones, right? There was an aircraft down in Florida, I think it was Eastern Airlines, right? Where it wasn't that there was anything wrong. It wasn't even a visibility problem. They went to go put the gear down, and one of the landing gear down lights didn't come on. And so they were 3 people in the cockpit, and they were all mucking around changing the light bulb to see if they could figure out if, was the nose gear actually down or not. And in the process, the autopilot kicked off and they accidentally descended into the Everglades. Right. But the big thing is controlled flight in the terrain. If you're not looking out the window and you can't see the terrain, it's much more likely that you're going to encounter it the wrong way. Okay. So from a visibility point of view, we're already starting with a bit of a problem, right? We can't see straight down from an airplane. We're not a helicopter. If you're in a Skyhawk and you're looking for, I did this arithmetic. I put the dot about where my eyes are. You may get. I'm pretty tall, so you might get different results, right? But I kind of did the arithmetic, and I came to the realization that I can see downwards at about 9 degrees. Okay. What that means is for me to see ground, I have to see rather far forward, right? So if I did a sine of theta, it gives me the ratio of the absolute altitude to the visibility required if I want to be able to see ground. Okay. So let's look at some examples. And then, by the way, I pulled these straight out of the simulator. I think they're pretty close, right? So here's an example, right? I've got the airplanes at about 2,000 feet, right? This is what 10 statute miles reported looks like. And I can tell you right by looking at this, there's a lot more than 10 statute miles visible here. But usually when they say 10 statute miles, what they mean is more than 10 statute miles. Right? Does this look like enough visibility to be able to know where you are and see what's going on?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's all right. So what happens if we drop down to 5 miles? Right? You can see at 5 miles of visibility, the horizon line is getting a little fuzzy. Right? We may not know exactly which way is up, but we can get pretty close. Right? I can see terrain, so I might not fly into something. But it's going to be pretty easy from if I'm just doing, pilotage, if I'm just navigating by looking out the window, it's pretty easy to get lost in this. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. If I go one more, that's 3 miles. Right? This is from 2,000 feet. We don't usually fly around to 2,000 feet. We're usually at least 3,000 feet, if not higher. And you can see at 3 miles visibility. I mean, you can see, if you look down to the side, you can see some stuff. But looking straight ahead, all you're seeing is haze. Right? So this is 3 statute miles is very commonly the minimum. That's the minimum in-flight visibility that we're allowed to fly in as VFR pilots. I don't know about you. I'm not going flying with 3 miles visibility under visual flight rules. Right? I'm probably not even going to go flying with 5 miles visibility. I've been there, and it's spooky. Okay. So just something to be aware of. So what happens if we climb up a little bit? Right? So instead of 2,000 feet, let's get up to a realistic cruising altitude of 6,000 feet. Right? So you can see things look a little different up here at 6,000 feet, but there's 10 miles visibility. So you're kind of seeing a little bit of haze at the horizon, but you have some pretty good view, right? 10 miles is good. Right? Take it down to 5. I can tell which way is down, at least in this simulation, I can tell which way is down. Right? In reality, if I'm at 6,000 feet, I may very well be on top of a haze layer. Right? And so that's where you can see kind of a horizon. But if you want to see anything on the ground, you got to look pretty much straight down. Right? So navigation, again, gets really, really hard. You're probably not at risk of a controlled flight into terrain, especially at 6,000 feet on the East Coast. Stay away from Mount Washington, and I'm sure you'll be fine. But it's still, it's still difficult from a navigation point of view. If I come down to 3 statute miles, you might as well be in a cloud. Right? And so this is where I strongly recommend that there are the legal limits here. And the legal limits are very permissive. And what I'm hoping is that you guys are going to recognize that and maybe say, you know what, my personal minimums, instead of it being 3 statute miles, it's going to be like 6 statute miles or 8 statute miles or something like that. Right? And this is where getting an instrument rating is a really good idea. Once you get your private pilot certificate, maybe the next stop might be an instrument rating. And the reason for that is now if you do feel the need to go flying on days like today, you can do it under instrument flight rules and actually, be able to do it safely. Okay. And then I just had to throw this in here. Don't forget, as you get into reduced forward visibility, we do have, flight instruments on this aircraft. Right. And so if I take a look at that attitude indicator, using that attitude indicator as a replacement for the attitude, instead of trying to keep the dirty side down, looking out that window, if you look at this instrument, and if you know how to use the instrument, right, you're probably going to be in a much better space. With the caveat that you're now relying on this instrument working. Trust me, as an instrument flight instructor, I spend a lot of time working with students, teaching them how to fly when these things go belly up. That's not something we cover in the private pilot curriculum. And so just, be aware that, this is a good for, I need to get out of this. It's not good for, hey, we can keep going. Right. But yeah, something to keep in mind. Okay. Any questions about that stuff?
Well, oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, you got a question?
Well, I was in a game and I put like the fog like really, really, really high.
Mhm.
And I was flying like close to the sea and I was relying on my attitude indicator. Next thing you know, the plane like dips to the left and I look at my attitude indicator and it flips like inverted. And I don't
Yep.
even know what I'm looking at and I can't see out the window and then I crash into the ocean and it's like
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I've flown and I've actually been in clouds under an instrument flight rules flight plan, and I've had my vacuum pump fail. And so all of a sudden, my attitude indicator is going goofy, my directional gyro is going goofy. Thankfully, I've been trained, right? And there are techniques that we use, but I'll tell you what, it had even having been trained on how to deal with it and being proficient on how to deal with it, it had my heart rate up. Right. So just it is something that can happen. Abrupt maneuvers can cause gyros to tumble. Right. So just just be conscious of that. Okay. So this is kind of the big picture. So when we start getting into airspace, what airspace is going to do is a big part of airspace is they define how do we separate ourselves from other aircraft, and they define what are the cloud clearance requirements and what are the visibility requirements that we have to deal with, right? So you're going to see this exact chart shows up on just about every FAA publication, I swear. Excuse me. And what it's trying to show you is it's trying to show you what the what the airspace looks like, right? It's not great, but it does give you kind of a rough idea of how things work, right? But let's kind of walk through them one at a time and try to get the big picture here, okay? So when it comes to normal airspace used by air traffic control, there are 6 major types, right? They are Class A, Class B, Class C, Class D, Class E, and Class G. We do not have Class F. Okay, there is such a thing as Class F airspace. So these classes are defined by the International Civil Aviation Organization as part of the United Nations, and so they define 7 classes of airspace. In the U.S., they just made the decision that we're just not going to do Class F airspace. Okay, so no Class F for us. But it's really pretty simple, right? So if you think about it, Class A is the most restrictive. Class G is the least restrictive, right? Class A is used for high altitude operations, and we're not allowed to fly VFR up there. We'll talk about that when we get to it. Class B, I remember B as being big airports, right? We're talking like Boston Logan. We're talking the New York Triplex. We're talking Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And you go down to Atlanta and Miami and Tampa and Orlando and, all these big, you might call them NFL-sized cities, right? That's typically where we find Class Bravo airspace. There are a lot of airplanes going in and out of Boston. If you want to get close to Boston, you need to be working very closely with air traffic control. Therefore, they're going to require that you get a clearance, right? Class C, these are some reasonably congested airports. And I always point out that, for both B but especially for C, when they decide what means congested, right? It's not so much the number of airplanes that are going in and out, it's the number of people that are going in and out, right? Because a midair, if you go to Portland, Sanford's busier than Portland when you look at aircraft counts, right? But a midair collision at Portland is very likely to be a mass casualty event. A midair collision at Sanford, and we lost a couple of Skyhawks, right? And so they put the Class C airspace up there. Again, what they're trying to do is they want to have control. They want to be talking to everybody who's in the airspace. They want to be able to play normally, but we're kind of getting back to normal a little bit, right? Portland's a lot more relaxed than Boston is, right? If you get down to Class D airspace, right? So these are kind of densely populated airports, but they're not.
So did you say that Portland was a Class C?
Portland is Class C, yes. Right? But you go down to Portsmouth. Portsmouth is a Class D. It means that they have a tower controller, and the controller has this cool system. It's called the Optical Traffic Management System, OTMS, otherwise known as they look out the window. Right? And so all they're doing is they're sequencing aircraft for takeoff and landing. You have to talk to them if you want to go into the Delta, right? Into the Class D airspace. But they're not really doing that much for you, right? We get into Class E. Class E does not have any entry requirements, right? We can fly airplanes in Class E airspace all day long and not talk to anybody. All a Class E means is that they do have the ability to separate IFR aircraft from other IFR aircraft, right? And then when we get into Class G, I like to say the G stands for good luck, right? It is completely uncontrolled airspace. There's no traffic separation going on. It's the Wild West, right? And then we'll talk in detail about the cloud clearance requirements inside of Class G, but we're only going to talk about that because you're going to get quizzed on it on the knowledge exam. And that's not mine, that's the FAA knowledge exam. It's important that you understand it for that purpose, but from an operational perspective, a VFR pilot has no business doing anything less than what they would do in normal airspace, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so let's kind of run through each one of them. So we have Class A airspace. Class A airspace is essentially the high altitude and route airspace that we have. It extends from 18,000 feet, right? 18,000 feet MSL. This is, by the way, I'm talking over the continental US. If you go up into Alaska, you go over to Hawaii, and especially if you go into foreign countries or out over the ocean, the rules change a little bit, okay? But over the continental US, which is where we are, right? Class A airspace exists between 18,000 feet MSL and flight level 600. What is flight level 600? Anybody know?
60,000 feet.
You're on the right track. Can you be more precise? It's a pressure altitude of 60,000 feet. So if you set your altimeter, so what happens is as you climb 18,000 feet is what's known as the transition altitude in the US, right? And so as you climb through 18,000 feet, the theory is once you're above 18,000 feet, you're not going to hit anything. There are no mountains in the continental US above 18,000 feet, right? And so what that means is as you get up that high, you're going to be going really fast. You're probably going a really long distance. It's a pain in the neck to keep having to change altimeters every 3 seconds. And so as you climb through that, you just go to a 29.92 altimeter setting. And we start above 18,000 feet, we just fly pressure altitude. We don't bother with local altimeter settings. Okay. So when you hear somebody say we're at flight level 350, they're not at 35,000 feet MSL. You're at a pressure altitude of 35,000 feet. All right. So Class A airspace goes from 18,000 feet at the bottom up to flight level 600 at the top. And there are rules, right? First big thing is aircraft are moving up there, right? When you're trucking along at 35,000 feet at Mach 8.7 or something, right? You're doing, 350, 400 knots true airspeed, sometimes even faster. There have been airplanes doing ground speeds of over 700 knots recently. Okay. If you're going 700 knots this way and I'm going, 300 knots the other way because I'm going into the wind, how long does it take us to go from where we can see each other to where we would potentially collide? It's not going to take very long, is it? Right. And so the rule, it says there's no visual flight rules going on up in Class A airspace. Okay. There's no see and avoid happening. Everybody's on an IFR flight plan. Everybody's being separated. It's just the way of the world. And so all these questions that we tend to ask don't really apply. There's a kind of a corner case, which people, the airport lawyers love to argue about, like in the glider world, they can do something called a wave window, where depending on who you talk to, either they allow gliders into Class A airspace under VFR, or they administratively convert Class A airspace into Class E airspace, and then the gliders can go in. It doesn't really matter. There are cases where very slow aircraft can climb up very high and get up into Class A under visual flight rules under those altitudes. Trust me, if you're going to encounter one of those things, you're going to get very well briefed, right? That's not what we're talking about here. From our perspective as VFR pilots flying airplanes, we are just not allowed in Class A airspace. That's the bad news. The good news is it doesn't really matter to us because it's so high that we couldn't get there even if we wanted to, right? Our Skyhawk's not going to get up there. Okay. So what do you really need to remember? You need to remember that you're not allowed in the airspace under visual flight rules. And you have to remember that it starts at, this is my favorite little mnemonic, it starts at 18,000 feet. Class A is 18,000 feet. I don't know. That's how I remember it. Okay. Questions about Class A? Let's look at Class B. So Class B is the big airspace around, around places like Boston. And so here you got the sectional chart that kind of, Class A doesn't show up on the sectional chart because it's just everywhere, right? Class B, though, we can see it on the sectional chart. So here's Boston in the middle, right? And you can see these blue concentric rings going out around it. This is what gets described as the upside down wedding cake, right? Because if you look in each one of these sectors, you look in the sector here, there's this little fraction that is 70 over 30. Does anybody know what that means? It means that the top of the airspace is at 7,000 feet and the bottom of the airspace is at 3,000 feet. Okay. And if I go throughout here, if I look here, the top is 7,000, top is 7,000, top is 7. Everywhere I go in this airspace, the top is usually going to be flat. It's going to be 7,000 feet everywhere. But the bottom of the airspace starts out fairly high, right? It's 3,000 feet over here. It's 4,000 feet over here. And then it descends towards the airport. The idea is if I've got a jet that's coming in to land, that jet's going to be out at like 4,000 feet out here, and then it's going to progressively descend as it gets closer to the airport. Okay. Some people describe this as the upside down wedding cake. Because it looks like, you get a little cake on the top and then the cakes get bigger as you go down, right? Well, in this case, the little cake's on the bottom and the cakes get bigger as you go up. Okay. There's a couple of rules here, right? One, if you want to go into this airspace, you have to expressly receive a clearance. You must hear something along the lines of cleared into the Boston class Bravo. Okay. Number two is you have to have an operable Mode Z transponder and ADS-B out. Oh, by the way, it's not just to go inside of the airspace. It's to get within 30 nautical miles of that primary airport. And so if you look here, you see this little magenta ring that goes all the way around the class Bravo. That magenta ring is 30 nautical miles from the airport reference point at Boston. So if you want to come inside that ring, you have to have ADS-B out, and you have to have an operable transponder. Okay. And so those are kind of the two. You can take a look. 14 CFR 91.131 it is a pretty good place to go. Okay. Inside of Class B, because of how busy it is, ATC will provide separation between aircraft. That means that if they're going to, when they clear you into the airspace, they're going to say, Sky 172 Tango Golf, you're cleared into the Boston class Bravo. And then the next thing out of their mouth is going to be fly heading X, maintain altitude Y. Because they don't want you climbing up or descending into other aircraft. They don't want you turning into other aircraft. They want you flying a straight line that they know what it's going to be. And they're taking responsibility for keeping you away from the other aircraft. Okay. And so on the flip side, they'll say, okay, you must have 3 statute miles of visibility. That's kind of the basic for having some sense of aircraft control. Beyond that, they expect you to remain clear of clouds, right? And then because it's controlled airspace, you're not supposed to operate below a ceiling of less than 1,000 feet AGL. We'll talk about that a little bit later, right? If you can't maintain this cloud clearance and maintain the actual clearance at the same time, you can't maintain the assigned heading and altitude and, keep 3 statute miles of visibility and clear of clouds. Well, in that case, what you're supposed to do is notify ATC immediately and they will, you can turn to stay out of the cloud, right? But you got to talk to ATC immediately and they'll give you an amended clearance. Okay. So that's just something to be aware of. Okay. So you can kind of imagine, like, the case. So let's say we're flying down towards, I don't know, we're going to Providence or something, right? And we say, hey, Boston approach. This is Skyhawk 53468. We'd like to transition the Boston class Bravo at 3,000 feet to Norwood. Right? I like using Norwood because that's like a good exit point out of the airspace, right? ATC may come back and say, hey, Sky, first of all, it's Boston. They're probably going to say unable to go around the airspace. But on a good day, they're going to say, hey, Skyhawk 53468, unable 3,000, because they won't send you through the airspace at 3,000. You are cleared into the class Bravo airspace. Descend and maintain 2,000, direct Boston, direct Norwood. And so what they just did was they gave you a routing. So they said, okay, descend to 2,000 feet, fly direct to Boston, and then direct to Norwood. By the time you get to Norwood at 2,000 feet, you're going to be out of the Bravo, right? And then you go ahead and you can come back with, descend and maintain 2,000, direct Boston, direct Norwood, cleared into the class. Well, I called it Bravo there, but cleared into the Bravo. Okay. The clearance is the important part. Expect them to say the magic words, cleared into the class Bravo, right? And then from then on, you still have to follow their directions. So if they tell you to turn to a heading, turn to the heading. If they tell you to climb to an altitude, climb to the altitude. And usually what they'll do is they'll run you right over Logan at a low altitude, because that amazingly is where the airplanes are not. Okay. We talked about the Mode C veil already, right? So it says if you're within 30 nautical miles of a primary airport and you are below 10,000 feet MSL, right, you're required to have an operable Mode C transponder and ADS-B out. People love to ask test questions about that, about the 10,000 feet MSL. It's the stupidest test question out there. Because if you're above 10,000 feet MSL, you're required to have a transponder and ADS-B out anyways, right? The only exception to that is if you're still within 2,500 feet of the ground, you can get away without it. I'm not aware of any case in the world where you're within a Mode C veil above 10,000 feet MSL and less than 2,500 feet above the ground. And if you're going to do that, you might as well have a transponder anyways. Okay. So something to be aware of, but just, keep in mind, that's what that little that red line means, is that you have to have the transponder in the Mode C and the ADS-B out. Okay. Any questions on that stuff? You guys are so quiet today. All right. Class C, right? So here's a beautiful Class C airspace. It looks a lot like Class B, right? So I got these big broad lines. I've got what looks like an upside down wedding cake, right? So we've got the center ring, which is the bottom of it is the surface, and the top of it is 4,100 feet, right? I've got the outer ring here. The bottom is 1,500 feet, and the top is 4,100 feet, right? And it's kind of the same exact setup. It's just the rules are a little bit more relaxed, right? And the way you tell the difference is it's got a magenta line instead of a blue line. Blue tends to be more restrictive. Magenta tends to be less restrictive. It's just the way I remember it, right? And I'll show you the exception later on today. So if I look at this little setup, right? It's centered on one or more airports. It has both lateral and vertical limits. Before you enter the airspace, you are required to have established two-way radio communications, and you have to have an operable Mode C or Mode S transponder, and you have to have ADS-B out, right? So it's kind of similar in some ways to Boston, except in this case, you don't need it as you're approaching the airspace. You only need it if you're in the airspace or above the airspace. You can go below the airspace without a transponder. If you come by the airport and grab a hold of Sue and I at lunchtime, I'll tell you a great story about taking our 1939 little Stinson through there. But the point is if you're in the airspace or above the airspace, you're required to have the Mode C transponder and the ADS-B out. Okay. ATC is actively participating. So generally speaking, ATC will separate IFR aircraft from IFR aircraft. Well, that's not us, so it doesn't really matter. They will also separate IFR aircraft from VFR aircraft. But what they won't do is separate VFR aircraft from other VFR aircraft. And so you still have some traffic responsibilities inside of Class C airspace. And so this is where we go to memorize this standard stuff, right? You got to be at least 500 feet below the cloud, 1,000 feet above the cloud, 2,000 feet horizontally from the cloud, and have 3 statute miles visibility. None of those are enough, but you got to know them for the test questions, right? And then again, you're not allowed to operate under a 1,000 foot, or under a ceiling of less than 1,000 feet AGL, which we'll get into here in a little bit. Okay. So you can imagine, like, let's say we're flying from, let's say we're flying from Sanford up to Brunswick here, right? You could imagine like an ATC conversation would be pretty straightforward. You say, you pop up, you might say something like, I'm terrible about phraseology. You might pop up and say, hello, Portland, Sky 53468, VFR request, right? What you're doing is you're saying to air traffic control, hey, I'm here, I got a question for you, right? ATC comes back and says, 53468, say request. And notice nobody ever asks a question on air traffic control, right? The reason is voice inflection gets lost a lot on the radio. So you were taught, say everything is a statement, right? So you might say, hey, Sky 53468, where it says no 172 over the Kennebunk VOR at 3,000, requesting radar services to Brunswick, right? Radar services, that's that service that we talked about earlier, right? And so ATC they're going to type on the computer for half a second, and they come back and they say, hey, Sky 53468, squawk 4242, Portland altimeter 29087. So we'll put 4242 in the transponder. We'll go, dial in 29087 on the altimeter, right? We'll read it back. Hey, 4242 and 29087, Skyhawk 53468. One little thing on this line, by the way, notice I never mush the numbers together. I've seen people respond to that kind of a call with 4242, 29087, 53468. And you're sitting there going, what are we talking about here? Right? It's not a phone number. And then a minute or so later, they come back, hey, 53468, your radar contact over the Kennebunk VOR. Right? And they might even say what altitude you are, and you can acknowledge it and you're good, right? At that point, we have a squawk code, we've been radar identified. We're allowed through the Class Charlie airspace. Right? And so we can just fly from Kennebunk right on up to Brunswick. When we get out of the airspace, we say, we'll go ahead and cancel flight following, or, cancel with you, or however you want to phrase it. And it'll tell you to squawk 1200 and go on your merry way. Right? Really pretty simple. I have a question for you. Assuming that at the beginning of this, we had the transponder in altitude mode with a code of 1200. Where in this process, at what point in this process are we officially allowed into the airspace? What do you guys think? Kind of a nerdy question, right? So remember, what are the requirements? The requirements is we have to have a Mode C transponder. And the requirement is that we have to have established two-way radio communications. Do we have a Mode C transponder? Even if it's squawking 1200?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. At what point have we established two-way radio communications?
Is it the initial radio contact?
Which one?
Is it when they acknowledge it?
It's when they say your tail number. So we said hello Portland, and they said 53468, say request. At that point, we're in. I mean, we got to keep talking to them. We can't just go dark on them and never talk to them again, right? But we're in, right? And this is where there's a little caveat here that some air traffic control facilities like to play. They may be really busy, right? So you're coming along and you say, hey, Portland Sky 53468, VFR request. And you might get two possible answers. One answer might be 53468, stand by. If they say 53468, stand by, and I'm coming up on the airspace, am I allowed into that airspace?
Yes.
Yeah, they said my tail number. use discretion, right? Let's not overload the controller on purpose. But yeah, I mean, from a legal perspective, you've been allowed into that airspace, right? If they say aircraft calling Portland, please stand by. Am I allowed in the airspace?
No, but what do you do?
You stay out of the airspace. It's kind of cool. We have this thing called a yoke that we can turn to make the airplane go different places, right? And so this is a good reason why we typically call, not right at the boundary, but you probably call 10 miles before you come into the airspace.
Okay, that was what I was kind of asking,
Yeah.
because you want to establish this before you enter the airspace.
Yes, good planning is very important here, right? But it's one of the things you hear. Sometimes you hear them say 53468, stand by, remain clear, class Charlie. Other times they just get smart and they, because they're busy, right? And frequency time is valuable to just say aircraft calling Portland, stand by. They mean the same thing. Don't go in the airspace. Okay. I know some people, they want to hear radar contact before they go in. That's fine. I've never flown into class Charlie airspace without hearing the magic words of radar contact. And radar contact means they have identified you on the scope. They know which dot is you, right? And so that's kind of a good thing. Okay.
Rob, I'm assuming then if you're calling them prior, like 10 miles out, they're going to track you even though you're not yet in the airspace once you've made this contact, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Right. They would actually rather talk to you than have you not talk to them. It makes their job easier. Because, if you can imagine, if you had a whole bunch of airplanes flying around that aren't talking to anybody, they don't know what you're doing. They don't know when you're going to turn. They don't know when you're going to climb or descend or anything like that. It just makes it harder for them as they're trying to keep other aircraft away from you. If you call them up and say, hey, I'm going to Brunswick, or if you call them up and say, hey, we're heading over to the coast here, we're going to do some air work. They do kind of like that. Now, I'll admit as an instructor, I don't tend to do that very much because it's really hard for me to talk to them and talk to you and do all the other things that I have to do. But they would probably prefer it if we did call them. Okay. All right. So any questions so far? You guys all having a good time? So it's right now 7:30. Do you guys want to go ahead and we'll take that 10-minute break?
Sure.
And then when we come back, we can finish up. We'll talk about class D, E, and G airspace. And then we've got a whole bunch of stuff to talk about special use airspace. And what that's all about. All right.
Okay.
Sounds good. So it's right now 7:32. Why don't we come back at 7:42 and we'll see if we can get this stuff wrapped up. So I'll see you at 7:42. So does anybody have any questions so far about anything come to your mind while we were on the break?
Well, I'm definitely gonna have to study aerospace because I don't have any experience in that.
Yes, airspace is it's sort of like when you go to the ski area and you got to remember what all the runs are, but imagine they took all the signs away and you still had to figure it out. So that's where the sectional chart here becomes just unbelievably important, right? So we've gone through A, B, and C, right? Now we've got D, E, and G to go, and then we'll get into the special use stuff. So Class D airspace, right? This is a nearby Class D airport. This is Portsmouth. It's just down the road from me. It's just a little ways south from Sanford, just over the border into New Hampshire. Again, right? They tend to orient air traffic control not so much around airplane counts, but they do it more around seat counts, right? And so Portsmouth is a fairly busy airport. There are some airline operations going in and out of there. There's a lot of corporate jets going in and out of there. And they have this little small organization called the United States Air National Guard. And they even have some active duty Air Force there. They do a lot of flying. Most of the flying in and out of there is tankers, the KC-46s, but they also have a lot of transient military coming through there. We see C-5s in there. We've had the airplane that serves as Air Force One. We've had that show up and start doing pattern work there. The world's largest Pilatus PC-12 operator is based out of there. So lots of stuff happens there, right? So it's a Class D airport. You can see that it's Class D because we have the little dashed blue line around it, right? And all it is just a single set of airspace that has a single floor and a single top. Generally speaking, that's what happens. Sometimes what'll happen though is actually, if I jump back here a few slides, if you look in here, this is this is kind of an interesting example. If you look over here, this is where my mouse is. This is the Beverly Airport. It's a towered airport down near Boston, right? The top is, I believe, at 2,600 feet. But you can see that it just kind of tucks underneath a bit of the airspace here, where the tops are only the bottom of the Class Bravo is 2,000 feet. B is bigger than D, so the Class Bravo takes precedence over the Class Delta, right? And there's some other similar situations. There's Class Charlies that are under Bravos. There's all kinds of weird, especially going to like Southern California and areas like that. There are a lot, or down in Florida, there are a lot of really weird kind of airspace stacks, right? But in this case, there's no significant overlying airspace, and so the whole airspace here goes up to 2,600 feet. And remember that the tower controller, sitting roughly where the star is, they don't have. Well, I mean, they do have radar. They have what's called a bright display, right? And so they have the ability to look at the radar and kind of see where you are on the radar. But it's not like they're not considered radar controllers. They can't use it to separate aircraft, right? It's just a situational awareness tool, that they have with them. And so primarily what they're doing is they're looking out the window and actually visually seeing aircraft and trying to visually separate the aircraft from each other, right? And so the result is we don't need to have a transponder or ADS-B out to fly into Class Delta airspace. Typically what we do is we just have to have two-way radio communications with the tower. That's it, right? Cloud clearance requirements. So again, that tower, they're going to sequence people to land, right? That's pretty much what they do. They sequence takeoffs and landings. They prevent themselves from having collisions on the runway. They taxi aircraft to and from the runway. So as far as your cloud clearance requirements go, remember, you are the one who's responsible for seeing and avoiding other aircraft. Therefore, you need to be 500 feet below the clouds, or 1,000 feet above the clouds, or 2,000 feet horizontally from the clouds, or 3 statute miles visibility. That's all that standard stuff. And because it's controlled airspace, you're not allowed to fly under a ceiling of less than 1,000 feet. Okay, which again we'll talk about when we get into special VFR. Okay, so a classic example, right? Let's say we're coming on down. Let's say we're coming from Sanford and we're going to go land in Portsmouth, right? A typical air traffic control exchange, it might go something like this, you pop up, you get, hello, Portsmouth, Sky 53468 VFR request, right? That little VFR request, it's the polite way of saying, I've got something, but it's your frequency. Let me know if you've got time to deal with me, right? And so they come back, 53468, say request, and you come in there and you say, hey, Sky 53468, we're Cessna 172, 10 miles north, landing with Yankee. Right, remember, because we were landing or taking off from the airport, we would probably go get that ATIS, the automatic terminal information system that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, right? And so here we're just saying that we have it, and they'll come back with an instruction. Hey, 53468, report a midfield right downwind for runway 34. Tells us what to do. Okay, we'll read that back to them. Okay, we'll report a midfield right downwind for runway 34, or Sky 53468. And so the next thing we'll do is we'll head in, we'll join the right downwind, midfield will say, hey, tower, 53468 on the midfield right downwind. And they'll probably say something really insightful like clear to land. Okay. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay. Class E is a little bit like Class D, just without the controller. Okay. So we can see again, is that same basic demarcation. So this is a place called Bennett Memorial out in Glens Falls, right? You can see it's kind of a weird shape because they actually use Class E to protect the approach paths, right? And all this is actually one form of Class E airspace. So Class E is, generally speaking, everywhere that isn't another class. Well, that's a dumb statement. Of course, it's everywhere that isn't another class, right? But it's excuse me, it's designed as like, it's kind of the default airspace that wherever they could provide separation, they will provide separation, right? And it comes in a couple of different forms. we have what are known as Class E surface areas, which is what this dashed magenta line indicates, right? So that means that Class E airspace here goes all the way to the floor. As you move away from the airspace, just like that upside down wedding cake that we saw around Class B and Class C, they have what are known as Class E transition areas, right? And specifically, if you look at this line here, it's fuzzy on one side and sharp on the other. On the fuzzy side, what it's saying is Class E starts at 700 feet AGL. On the sharp side, it's saying Class E starts at 1,200 feet AGL, right? And we'll see that there are a few more, a few more beyond that, right? Generally speaking, from there, from 1,200 feet, it's going to go all the way up to the overlying airspace. So in this case here, it's going to go all the way up to the bottom of Class A. So up to 17,999 feet, it's all Class E, right? And then we go up through Class A up to flight level 600, right? At a pressure altitude of 60,001 feet, you're back in Class E again. Okay, and then that Class E goes all the way to Mars or wherever it goes, right? Rules are, if you want to fly under IFR in Class E, you have to have a clearance, same as you would for D, for C, for B, and obviously for A. For VFR aircraft, there are absolutely no entry requirements for us, right? But what they do is they give you some restrictions, right? So ATC is going to separate IFR aircraft from other IFR aircraft in this airspace. They don't even touch VFR aircraft, right? We're just allowed in there and we can do whatever we want and go wherever we want, right? By the way, Class E, the airline crews like to call it bandit country because that's where all the, people like us are flying around and just doing crazy things. And we haven't seen Eve in a while, but she's probably out doing aerobatics in her aircraft, right? Pilot clearance requirements get a little tricky because Class E goes up above 10,000 feet a lot. And so it's the standard 500 below, 1,000 above, 2,000 horizontal, 3 statute miles when you're down below 10,000 feet. Once you get to 10,000 feet and above, it becomes that 1,000 below, 1,000 above, 1 statute miles horizontal, and you need to have at least 5 statute miles of visibility just because of the much longer slant range to see the ground. Okay. So there are a lot of different variations on Class E airspace, right? So we saw a couple of them here, right? So if I look at this is the same chart that we just had on the previous slide, right? You got the airspace around the airport is a Class E surface area, right? Then you get out here on the fuzzy side of this magenta line. Class E starts at 700 feet AGL, right? You get on the sharp side of that fuzzy line of that magenta line. And now it's going to be 1,200 feet AGL going all the way up to the Class A overhead. But there's some other steps that you can have. There's this one little place over in Southwest Texas that I've been able to find where they have a blue line with a fuzzy side and a sharp side, right? On the fuzzy side, that's the same 1,200 feet, right? So it says 1,200 feet AGL on up to the Class A. Over here on the sharp side, Class E doesn't start until 14,500 feet. Okay. And so underneath that is going to be Class G airspace, which we'll talk about here in a second. And then we also get into some kind of goofy ones, right? So if we look over here, this is actually just off the coast. This is just a few miles from where we fly, right? As you get off the coast, radar coverage gets worse and worse and worse. You got to get higher and higher and higher before you can be seen on radar because, the Earth is round and stuff like that. And so we can actually see here, if we start over at, like, this is the Biddeford Airport, right around Biddeford, it's 700 feet AGL for that transition area, right? Then we come outside of this, it's going to pop up. You can see a little sign here. It's going to pop up to 1,200 feet AGL until we get to this kind of sawtooth line. At the sawtooth line, you're going to see that there's an enunciation in here in the middle. It says 2,000 MSL. And so we go up to 2,000 feet MSL in here. I don't, for the life of me, understand why, but it drops back down to 1,700 MSL as the floor of the Class E. And then it goes up to 5,500 feet MSL out here, right? So as you get offshore, you tend to see a lot of weirdness around the heights. And if you take a look, I haven't really been showing you guys this, but don't forget that our sectional charts have a legend. and you can kind of see what that legend looks like, right? So it talks about, Class E surface areas around a Class D. Sometimes they protect approaches that way. They have Class E surface areas just as they are. You've got the 700 foot to 1200 foot line. You got the 1200 foot to 14,500 MSL line. Remember that 14,500 is MSL, not AGL, right? And then they show you these lines. And they even show you an enunciation here where they can tell you where the top of the Class E is as well, right? So it can get kind of complicated. You'll get the hang of it. It's not that hard. Okay. It doesn't really affect your life that much if you get it wrong. Okay. But just, just some stuff to be aware of. Okay. Then we get into my favorite airspace. Okay. Class G airspace. The G stands for good luck. This is also known as the drone zone because legally this is where UAS operators can operate their aircraft. Okay. So it exists between the surface and any overline controlled airspace. So that could be Class E, right? If the Class E over Sanford starts at 700 feet AGL, so at 944 feet plus or minus whatever the hills do, right, is where we see the beginning of Class E. Anything below that is Class Golf, right? There are no entry requirements at all. You are allowed to fly in Class G airspace. Good luck, have a good time, right? You can fly IFR in this airspace and not have a clearance. You can fly VFR and not have any separation or anything along those lines. It has insanely complicated and insanely permissive cloud clearance requirements. They're not for us. Okay? If you get an instrument rating and you go out there and you start flying IFR, sometimes what you're going to do is you're going to fly an approach into an airport like Sanford, right? And what happens is you fly the approach, you land at this non-tower airport. What you have to do is before they can send the next aircraft in, they have to have you do what's called cancel IFR. And a lot of times it gets complicated because if you're coming from, like if you're flying the ILS into Sanford, lands on runway 7, you're coming from the southwest, you're coming from Boston's airspace. So you get vectored onto the approach from Boston. Boston clears you on the approach. You come on down, you get down there, you land. You then have to change radio frequencies, get a hold of Portland clearance, call Portland clearance, say, hey, we're going to go ahead and cancel IFR. Portland clearance then has to pick up the phone and call over to Boston and say, hey, they just canceled IFR. And only when that information has been relayed to Boston can they clear the next airplane on the approach. And so the shortcut is sometimes when you're on short final and you've got good VFR clearance, weather minimums and everything's happy, landing is assured, you just get on the radio and say, hey, Boston, we're going to go ahead and cancel IFR. And now Boston can send that next airplane in a lot faster, right? And so what they do here is they say, all right, if you're below 1,200 feet AGL, so you're getting close to the ground, and it's daytime, as long as it's clear of clouds, you've got 1 statute mile of visibility, you're good to go. Go ahead and cancel IFR, right? At night, they want a little bit more, right? At nighttime, they want, the standard 500 below, 1,000 above, 2,000 feet horizontal, and 3 statute miles of visibility, right? I don't think that's quite right. I think that's supposed to be a 3 statute mile too. Daytime, if you're 1,200 and above, they want a little bit more. But generally speaking, they give you these little outs about, having 1 statute mile visibility and some very permissive cloud clearance requirements. Okay. You will need to know these for the test. So you do want to study them and actually know them. You will never, I hope, I pray, as VFR only pilots, you will never use these in the real world, right? Just treat it as Class E airspace and you'll be fine. Okay. But it is a testable thing. So make sure you know it for your written test and for your check ride, right? And then what I did was I put together like this little cheat sheet here. And this little cheat sheet is, I didn't put it together. I stole this little cheat sheet from the FAA that kind of breaks down all the different, airspace types and what the cloud clearance requirements are, right? So, please enjoy it. Okay. So I have an airspace quiz for you. Anybody want to take an airspace quiz? I bet Luke wants to take an airspace quiz. You ready, Luke?
Okay.
How about this? We're getting called. So you see where the arrow on the A is pointing out, right? Right, pretty much to the S and the ATIS. Starting from the surface and going to the moon, what are the different as you go up, what are the different classes of airspace?
Starting from the surface to the moon, what are the different classes of that's class C. Oh wait, no, that's class B airspace that the arrow is pointing at. So,
I'm sorry, did you say class Bravo or class Delta?
well, it's blue. I think blue is class B, right?
I can't
Yeah.
hear whether you're saying B or D. Is it Bravo or Delta?
I think it's Delta because
Okay, yep.
it's not as big.
Okay, yep. Yeah, because the dash blue line says it's Delta, right? Where is the top at that point? Where is the top of the Delta?
Top of the Delta. 325. I don't know the altitude of the class C airspace, so I don't know.
Is it, do we look at that 43/15? Is it top of that would that be 4,300?
You're really close. Well, actually, no, the top of the Delta, well, there's two numbers given, right? There's the top of the Delta here is listed as 2,700.
Oh, okay.
Right? But there's also the bottom of the Charlie. And what you're looking at in that 43/15 is it's saying within this sector here that I'm drawing my mouse around, right? That the bottom of the Charlie is 1,500 feet. But we're not in that sector. We're in this sector.
The 4325.
Right. So the bottom of the Charlie is 2,500 feet, right?
Gotcha.
So at this point, is the top of the Delta, is it the published top of the Delta? Or is it the published bottom of the Charlie? Kind of a trick question, right? So what it is Charlie takes precedence over Delta. Charlie's a more important airspace. And so at that point, the Delta goes up to 2,500 feet. And then from 2,500 feet to 4,300 feet, you're going to be inside the Charlie. Does that make sense? Kind of weirdly?
Yes.
Does that make sense to you, Luke?
Kind of.
Yep. So remember, the lower, like A is more important than B, B is more important than C, C is more important than D, D is more important than E, right? The more restrictive airspace wins. Okay.
Kind of like right away at an airport or something.
Exactly. Okay. So we get up to 4,300 feet. What's above the Class Charlie airspace?
Is Class E?
It is Class E, right? Because E stands for everywhere. Well, almost. Right. So
Until you get to Class A?
So it's Class E. So where does Class A start?
At 18,000?
18,000 feet, exactly. And so we keep going up. Where's the top of the Class A?
Oh, does it go back to E or something? Weird.
But where's the top of the Class A?
$60,000 pressure altitude.
Yep, flight level 600, right? And so what's above the top of the Class A? Which we'll never get to in a Skyhawk.
I think India said it before. It was Echo.
It
goes
is.
back to E,
It
yeah.
goes back to Echo, right? And then Echo goes how high? All I can say is if there are any space aliens out there
Yeah,
who
right, infinity, right.
inside of a cloud on their own planet, they're technically in violation of FAA regulations if they don't have a clearance. Right? So, I mean, it goes up to infinity from there. The space station is, I think, legally in Class E airspace. Okay. Make sense?
Yep.
Yes.
All
I
right.
just have a question about this, the what we're looking at here. Because we're in one of the rings, which is one of these airspaces that is not basically E, but sort of is everything else G and E, no, E. G is low down and E is everything unless it's in one of these
Right.
rings. I know that sounds weird, but am I on the right track?
Pretty much. At the altitudes where we fly, yes. Right. So you're in G for the first 700 to 1200 feet normally after takeoff, depending on where you take off. But we're usually spending a whole lot of time down there anyways. And so very quickly we're going to end up in Class E airspace. And so if you just assume that you're always in Class E, you can't really go wrong.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. All righty. So I want to circle back to something, right? We talked a lot about how in controlled airspace, you are not allowed to fly VFR with a ceiling of less than 1,000 feet. So, question for you. What's a ceiling?
The distance from land to the clouds, whether or not they're overcast or broken.
And those are the two keywords, right? We're talking about broken or overcast layers. If I have few or scattered, it's not technically a ceiling. So I can have few at 900, scattered at 900, I'm good to go. Broken at 900 or overcast at 900, I can't take off, right? If I at an airport like Sanford, I don't care about that, right? At least not as much, because here I am, I'm in Class G airspace. As long as they don't go into Class E airspace, I'm good to go, right? Okay. Don't be playing that card too often, because you're still going to get trouble somehow, right? But if you go to a towered airport, or you go to a Class E service area airport like Concord, right, you're going to have to make sure that you do want to have that 1,000-foot ceiling, right? Or I should say, you don't want to have a ceiling below 1,000 feet. Okay. But I'm going to tell you the story, right? So I was ferrying an airplane up from Atlanta a few years ago, right? A VFR only aircraft. And I'm sitting there at the Richmond airport, and in Richmond, Virginia, getting ready to take off in the morning. And I'm looking, and there's what I would have called a scattered cloud layer over the airport. But at pretty much the airport boundary, the scattered cloud layer stopped. And when I listened to the ATIS was reporting broken at 900 feet. And I wanted to go. And I was convinced that I could go safely, right? This is the one and only time that I've ever requested a special VFR clearance. And so got on the radio, I called the ground controller, said, hey, we're over here at the FBO and like to, I'm getting ready to launch. I'd like to, see about getting a special VFR out of here. And in this case, the controller said, stand by. I'm like, oh, okay, this is going to be a pain in the neck. And sometimes special VFR is a pain in the neck, which we'll talk about why in a second. And about 2 minutes later, the guy comes back and says, let's say it was information Mike was current. He came back and said, let me know when you have information November. And I went over and I listened to information. What he did was he went out and did a weather observation, updated the ATIS, and now it was reporting fewer scattered at 900 feet, right? And so I didn't need the special VFR anymore. The idea, though, is I can use special VFR to get out from like these localized weather conditions, okay? So in order for me to operate under special VFR, what I have to do is I have to get a clearance. So I have to coordinate with air traffic control, and air traffic control will separate me from other traffic, right? I have to have visibility of at least 1 statute mile, and I have to be able to remain clear of clouds. Oh, and I have to be below 10,000 feet MSL, right? If I can do this, life is good, right? During the day, it's a piece of cake. Any VFR rated pilot can do it during the day. At night, you actually have to be flying an instrument equipped aircraft and have an instrument rating and be instrument current, right? And so this is kind of a day for us. This is going to be kind of a daytime only thing. It's not a place you want to go very often, right? I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've heard airplanes getting special VFRs. Helicopters do it all day long, right? They love special VFR. But there have been some famous accidents because of that. But as far as the As far as, airplanes go, we don't use it a lot. It's a great test question that the FAA likes to ask test questions on. And it is a good tool every once in a while when really it's when the weather reporting doesn't match up with the real world weather, right? If that kind of makes sense. Okay. So a couple of restrictions to special VFR. One, not all airports allow for special VFR, right? You can look in Part 91, Appendix D, Section 2 or Section 3, something like that, has a list of airports that don't allow it. Or the easier thing is you just look at here we are on the sectional chart, looking at Boston, right there on it, it says no SVFR. Don't even ask for a special VFR. They won't give it to you. Number two, special VFR traffic has to be separated from IFR traffic. And special VFR aircraft may not delay IFR traffic. So the busier the airport you're at, the harder it is to get in and out without, to use a special VFR, right? So just to be aware. But if you're in a Class E surface area, if you're in a Class, here, whatever, you can get the special VFR to at least get you out of the surface area into Class G airspace, where you can legally be below that ceiling. So, or maybe get around the clouds and then climb up or something. So, kind of make sense?
Yep.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. Sounds good. And then we're going to move into the don't scare anybody part of the presentation. Okay. So we have a section here, a bunch of airspace is known as special use airspace. And what special use airspace is it's airspace that for a variety of reasons, it could be a national security reason, could be a safety reason, could be a whatever, they don't really want people flying into. Okay. And so it kind of boils down into two kind of groups. You have what I would call the permanent airspace and versus the temporary airspace. The temporary airspace are the temporary flight restrictions. The permanents are not temporary flight restrictions, although there's some temporary flight restrictions that are surprisingly permanent. And then we also, and then within them, there's a variety of different types, right? So we have everything from alert areas, which is just, you be careful flying in there, right? To prohibited airspace, which is keep out or else. Okay. That's over on that special use type. And that includes things like military operations areas, military training routes, national security areas, restricted airspace, warning areas, prohibited airspace, stuff like that. Over on the other side, we have temporary flight restrictions. And these are kind of the same thing, but they only pop up for a little while, right? And they pop up for a couple different reasons. One would be a VIP TFR. Joe Biden comes to town. Boy, do they shut down a lot of airspace. I really wish he'd start doing his stuff over Zoom. Okay. Public protection TFRs, right? They don't want you flying over Fenway Park at, 2,000 feet during the middle of a Red Sox game. There's a lot of people down there. There's a lot of airplanes doing banner tow and taking pictures and all that other stuff that are supposed to be there for work. Just stay away, be nice, right? There are collision avoidance TFRs, right? And there's a whole bunch of these, right? There's space launch. If they're shooting SpaceX off the, pad at Cape Canaveral, they'd really rather didn't run into a Skyhawk. There's firefighting, right? You go out, especially on the western part of the country, they get these big brush fires going on, right? And they're bringing in all these aircraft, and tankers are just dropping load after load after load of whatever the fire retardant is on the fire. They'd be a lot happier if your Skyhawk wasn't in there. They'd be especially happy if the news helicopter wasn't in the way, right? And then we see it with air shows, right? They do the they do the air shows at Pease every year or so, right? When the Blue Angels are doing their acrobatics and all the other stuff that they do. Again, they probably not a great idea to be blasting through there in your Skyhawk. Okay. And then they also have safety TFRs. When they go out there and they start blowing stuff up, right? They're going to probably stay away. When they are doing, some sort of exercise where they're blasting radiation into there's all kinds of stuff that happens out there. These TFRs are, for the most, some of them are pretty silly. But for the most part, they're a really good idea. Okay. So just we just got to be reasonable about them. So let's kind of run through these, right? So the most relaxed version of special use airspace is something called an alert area. And Sue knows this alert area quite well because she flew right past it the other, what about 9 months ago on the air race?
Yeah, about that.
Yep. So it is literally just an area where there is concentrated flight training. There's a whole lot of flight training going on in this space. The big practice area. The schools involved. There's a lot of schools out of this Homestead Air Force Base, not Air Force Base, General Aviation Airport. They spend a lot of. They do a lot of. There's just a lot of airplanes in the area. So they say, hey, it's an alert area. Be cautious. Tells you right here. Concentrated flight training. What to look out for. Okay. There's also a lot of nothing in there because I think it's pretty much right over the Everglades. Okay. There's nothing says you can't fly through it. You're completely allowed to fly through it. It's just a warning. Okay. And that's the same kind of thing we get for a military operations area. Right. So we have up here in the Northeast, we have the over around Lake Winnipesaukee, they got the Yankee 1 and the Yankee 2 MOAs. Right. And this is where a space where the military can come and play. And they can, have mock dogfights with their aircraft, or they can run C-130s through there at low altitude. And they do all kinds of stuff up there, right? IFR aircraft are always routed around active military operations areas. VFR, there's nothing saying we can't go through, right? What they are saying is there's a risk, right? And so you can see that they're charted. And when they're charted, they don't give on the chart, they don't give any altitude information, right? But what you can do is if you look on the margin of the chart, and then there's also ways your EFB will probably give it to you as well, right? If you look on the margin of the chart, there are these little sections where it says, hey, we're looking at the Yankee 1 MOA here. For the Yankee 1 MOA, right, goes up to 9,000 feet, or is it at 9,000 feet? Right? It's from sunrise to sunset. The controlling authority is Boston Center. You can call them on 135.7 and they'll tell you what's going on. Right? And so it's a good way for you to kind of get intel and say, hey, is this MOA active? And if it is active, what are they doing in it? If they're playing at 9,000 feet and above, well, then if I want to fly into the Mount Washington Regional Airport, I just make sure I stay below 9,000 feet. Right? So it does work pretty well as a process. But I know a lot of people just completely ignore the whole thing and they just go blasting in there, and it's kind of a pain in the neck. Okay. It's just a zoom in on that thing. Okay. Kind of similar to military operations areas, they also have what are called military training routes, or MTRs. And there's two versions of them. They're the instrument training routes, sometimes called IRs, sometimes called ITRs. And they're the visual training routes, sometimes called VRs or VTRs. And you can kind of guess the difference between them, right? Instrument training routes, somebody's looking inside at the flight instruments, trying to fly this thing like they can't see outside. And they're using things like a radar to try to see the ground and stuff like that. Visual, hopefully they're looking outside. But whether it's visual or instrument, be advised, these aircraft can be moving, right? They are not restricted by the 250 knot restriction. They're playing like they're at war, right? This is a military training route. And so just, be aware that, these are, you want to know what's going on with these military training routes, right? There are two, I look at the number here, so like this one here that I'm looking at, this is instrument route 850. I can actually, by using that instrument route 851, I can identify who it is, right? But number two is by looking at the number of digits in the instrument route. And I know this is kind of goofy. The number of digits here, it tells me that this route extends above 1,500 feet AGL, right? If it had a 4-digit code, the entire route is below 1,500 feet AGL. What does that tell me? I see a 4-digit code, get above 1,500 feet AGL, in theory, I should be fine, right? But I do want to put one thing in here. It's a training route. Anybody know what training involves? It involves mistakes. You're going to find this out in flight training, right? You guys are going to make mistakes in flight training. That's how you learn. It's normal, right? If you never made a mistake in flight training, I'd wonder why the heck we're doing the flight training, right? Same thing happens here. These are training routes. A lot of mistakes happen. And so where you may see the center line is here, the airplane might wind up over here, or might wind up over there. Sometimes they go out of altitude, right? You're human beings flying these aircraft. As much as, as much as the military pilots would love to tell us otherwise, they're not all perfect. Okay. And so just, give them a little bit of a buffer and you'll be fine. So you can see here in this case, they're saying it's between 2,000 and 6,000. I might want to be over 7,000 feet when I go by, just out of an abundance of caution. Okay. Next one we have here is something called the national security area, right? And this is the polite version of special use airspace, right? So this one's out in upstate Washington, over near Seattle somewhere, right? And they just put this polite little notice that says, for reasons of national security, pilots are requested to avoid flight at and below 2,900 feet MSL in this area. And you can see it's this dash magenta line around the area. I don't know what's there. They're not going to put it on the chart. There's something there. I don't know if they don't want us to see it. I don't know if we get in the way of what they're doing. I have no idea why. Do me a favor when you see this stuff, if at all possible, honor it. And the reason is if you don't honor it, eventually what was a national security area where if you make a mistake and go into it, no harm, no foul, becomes a restricted airspace. Okay. Restricted airspace is where there is an operational hazard or there's a very good reason why they don't want you in that airspace. And so what they say is for restricted airspace, if it's active, you are legally required to stay out of it unless you have permission from the controlling agency. Okay. And so once again, we can go over. So if I look over by over near Fort Devens, it's between Fitchburg and Minuteman, it's in Massachusetts, right, 30 miles ish from Boston. There's this little itty bitty little piece of restricted airspace around Fort Devens, right? They do weird things. They you can see the little parachute symbol. It gives you an idea of what happens over there, right? It's not always active, right? If I look at it, it says it's R4102 A and B. So if I come down here, I can see R4102A, 2, but not including 2,000 feet. It's intermittent from 7:30 in the morning until 2200. And by the way, that's local time, right? The controlling authority is the Boston Tracon, and you can reach them on 124.4, right? For 4102B, it goes up to 3995, so just under 4,000 feet. And other than that, pretty much everything's the same. They're kind of giving you the information on how to find out if it's active or not, right? If you need to, for some reason, there's a weather situation and the only way for you to get out of there is to go through that airspace, you can get Boston to give you permission, right? Permission from Boston is completely valid, and then you can go through it all day long, okay? So just something to be aware of. So what you want to do is you want to check with Boston before you fly through that airspace, okay? We also, if we go off to the coast, you're going to see a lot of these things called warning airspaces. And warning airspace is always off the coast. It's always over water, right? And the reason is if it wasn't over water, then it would be over our territorial airspace. And if it was over our territorial airspace, they would just make it restricted airspace, okay? Warning areas are exactly like restricted airspace. There's stuff happening in there that could be dangerous to you. It could be, might be hazards. It might be a national security concern. It might be all kinds of other stuff. But because it's over international waters, they don't have the right to say, you cannot go in there. And so what they do is they say, we really recommend that you don't go in there, right? I describe this as somewhere between a national security area and a restricted airspace. It's kind of like a national security area with attitude, right? And again, we go in here, we can see who, this is Whiskey 104A. I can look it up in that margin chart. I can find it. It goes up to 10,000 feet. It's intermittent by NOTAM. And if you really want to find out what's going on, talk to Boston Center. And that just says anybody in Boston Center can talk to you, right? So, this is where the P-8s are out there dropping sonobuoys, and this is where they practice shooting missiles and stuff like that, right? So just I've got a few friends in the Navy, and they are adamant, stay the heck out of an active warning area. It's for your own good, right? And then we get into this stuff called prohibited airspace areas. Prohibited areas, we have one right near us. There's this gentleman by the name of George Herbert Walker, or I'm sorry, he's no longer there. There's a gentleman by the name of George W. Bush, former president of the United States, likes to come and hang out on Walker's Point, which is right there. And so there's a little 1 nautical mile radius prohibited airspace around Walker's Point. It's Papa 67. It goes up to 1,000 feet, right? It is continuous. It is always active. And there is no controlling agency. What that means is you're pretty much not getting permission, right? It can be done. You have to go through the Secret Service and get permission that way. Sue knows all about that process. But generally speaking, yeah, just it's prohibited. It means you're not allowed in there. Just plan on not going in there. Okay. We'll get Sue to tell you the story about her time in Papa 67 sometime because it was kind of cool. Okay. But not today because we're running out of time. So you want to find out what's going on. There is a website out there. It's called sua.faa.gov, specialuseairspace.faa.gov. If you go up there, it tells you kind of what is active, what's going to be active, and it does a reasonably good job of telling you like what kinds of things are going on. It's really is up for planning purposes. It doesn't take away from your need to go out there and get a briefing before flight. Don't forget to always call that 1-800-WX-BRIEF or go to the 1-800-WXBRIEF.com website. Or you can do, there are functionally similar ways, but realistically, these are the 2 best ways that I found to get that pre-flight briefing, right? It's recorded, it's tracked, they know what you've shown, and, they do a really good job. Okay. For temporary flight restrictions, now remember, we have all those different types of temporary flight restrictions. There are way too many variations to talk about. And, oh, by the way, they don't really list them in the way that I described them, right? So if you look at them, right, they've got the TF, they do tell you the type, right? They got the security type, the VIP type, the hazard type, and so on and so forth. The easiest way to kind of get, for planning purposes, to find out about any kind of flight restriction is you go in there to tfr.faa.gov. And they've got a couple different, they give you a list of them. You can also pull up the TFR map, which will actually put them on the map, right? You can go in there and you can read the actual NOTAMs that go along with them. Really good stuff. That being said, something about the temporary flight restrictions is they often fall off a schedule, right? So we currently have a president of the United States who's not all that good at staying on a schedule. I'd never experienced it with him as president. I remember when he was vice president, when you'd see a vice presidential TFR pop up, you knew that it was going to run 2 hours late, right? It's a personality thing. And so I strongly recommend that if you're flying anywhere where there's any hint of a TFR, make sure you get a briefing so you know the last minute what's going on right before you launch. Make sure you talk to air traffic control and try to work with air traffic control to understand, did that TFR actually expire when the TFR is supposed to expire? Okay. And then kind of this is kind of a weird one, right? It's not really a special use airspace, but it is something we want to pay attention to. We have these things called wildlife refuges. Right, we have a bunch of them around us. They're the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge. It's not one contiguous refuge. It's a bunch of little stuff. And you'll see on the chart, you'll see these little images that have the line with the dots on them. If it's a blue one, it means it's a wildlife refuge, and we are, as pilots, are requested to not fly over the area at less than 2,000 feet AGL. All right, it's not punitive, and I'll be honest with you, I called them and was doing a safety seminar and tried to get them to come in and talk about the need to stay out of the wildlife refuge. And they were like, it's not that important to us. We're not going to show up, right? You go out on the West Coast and they have these little marine areas that have basically the same indication, but they're magenta, right? These they aren't kidding about. These are run by NOAA, and NOAA will come after you, and they will, at the very least, find the ever-living daylights out of you if you violate this. So in this case here, this one here, they say flight operations below 1,000 AGL over the designated areas within the greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary violate NOAA regulations, see 15 CFR 922, right? What bothers me about this is the color code's backwards. Everywhere else, right? If we go back here and we look at like prohibited airspace and warning areas and restricted airspace, right? Right, it's all blue. When I get back into like military operations areas, right, we're looking at red, right? Magenta is less restrictive than blue. Well, in this case, magenta is more restrictive than blue. And it's just that the blue was there first and they had to figure out a symbol for the other one. So just do me a favor, be careful of it. Please try to honor them as best you can. Definitely some good stuff. So that's it.